Welcome to Dialogues in Afro-Latinidad, a podcast dedicated to amplifying and elevating Afro-Latin American and Afro-Latinx histories, cultures, and communities. I'm your host, Dr. Michelle Reed-Vasquez. Join us for conversations with experts and artists to learn more about Afro-Latinidad. Venga.
Hello and welcome back. My name is Israel Herndon and I'm guest hosting 5 special episodes with participants from the 2022 Summer Institute on Afro-Latin American and Afro-Latinx Studies funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities. This 2-week conference was hosted by the Afro-Latinidad Studies Institute, which also runs this podcast. And today I'm excited to welcome Ashley Ngozi Agbasoga. Ashley Ngozi Agbasoga is a scholar and writer whose research interests include Black and Indigenous hemispheric feminism, racializations, especially in settler colonial regimes in Latin America, nation-state formation, foodways, and geography. Her training at the intersections of anthropology, Black studies, Indigenous studies, and archival research continue to inform her teaching interests and academic work. She is currently working on 2 projects. The first contends with ongoing settler colonialism and mestizo nation-state formation during the shift to multiculturalism throughout the Americas. The second connects the Black/Indigenous Pacific and Atlantic worlds through foodways. Both projects think with the rise of Afro-Indigenous and Black/Native visibility as a mode of unsettling foundational racial logistics throughout the Americas. Currently, she is an assistant professor/faculty fellow at the Gallatin School of Individualized Study at New York University. She earned her PhD in anthropology from Northwestern University in 2022. Before arriving at NYU, she was also a predoctoral fellow at the Woodson at the University of Virginia from 2020 to 2022. Born and raised between Austin, Texas and Canton, Mississippi, she is also a former organizer and proud CUNY alumna. In her spare time, she loves to cook big meals and be by the water and see new places. Hi, Ashley. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. How are you, Israel?
Good. And we're so glad to have you here. But just to get things started off, how did you become interested in Afro-Latinidad?
Ooh, oh my gosh. A long, funny story. I'll try to abridge it as much as I can. So I grew up in Texas, between Texas and Mississippi, but mostly in Texas, in a predominantly Latina community, mostly Tejanos, Mexican Americans, and recent migrants from Mexico, which is super, super important to distinguish in a place like Texas for lots of various reasons. But yeah, I noticed growing up that there were like distinct and sharp racial lines on who could be considered Latino and who cannot be considered Latino, right? And Blackness was out of that purview. So I remember being taught that, for instance, all enslaved Africans ever brought to this side of the world, which history books will call the New World, and I put that in quotations. I was taught that they were all brought to what is now the United States, some in Canada, and not Latin America at all, right? So that's a really important part of how I got to the work, because I didn't know that Black people existed in Latin America until college, till I moved to New York City for college, and I saw people who looked like me speak Spanish, right? It's really what's the word? That's not a curse word. It's messed up that
Yes.
that I wasn't taught that, but also that everything that surrounded Latinidad, particularly from a Mexican perspective, constantly excluded Blackness. So I remember when this might age me a bit, but when Oye Mi Canto came out, the song, and the remix came out with Noriega, and Noriega, the rapper, was, like spitting or whatever. And I remember all of us at school being like, that guy looks Black. And people like Latinx folks being like, oh no, he's Indio, it's just the sun. Right.
Oh,
so until I got to college and being like, oh, actually, no, there were millions, right? 93%. I think the statistic is like 93% of enslaved Africans were brought to Latin America and the Caribbean.
Mm-hmm.
Only, I think, like 6 or 7% were brought to what is now the United States. And so I guess from there, it's taken me on a long journey to the work I do now, but essentially I keep asking, why was I not taught this, both in the US system, but also why is it issued from Latin American histories that are taught in the US and in Mexico, where I currently work? Why did it take up until 2019 for the Mexican Senate to recognize Afrodescendientes in Mexico? Where still today, people will say Black people do not exist in Mexico. And if they do, they're foreigners or they're criminals, right? So these stories and narratives kind of shape why I do the work that I do today.
And thank you for sharing that. I think that it's something that we hear a lot in this field is about the invisibility of Afro-Latinx and what their experience looks like.
Yeah.
And so with that, what are you passionate about with this topic? And I know folks have heard your bio and you do a lot of different things.
I do too much. What am I
would
passionate
you say?
about?
Mm-hmm.
That very question. Why? My parents have always said I'm a nosy kid, and and all my friends will say I am nosy in the best ways, because I'm like, well, why did that happen? Right? So once again, that question, why has Blackness and Black indigeneity been issued for, or like excluded from the narrative of Latin America and the Caribbean, right? And what implications does that have for thinking about Latinidad, or not, or outside of Latinidad, here in the United States, right? So this is timely, I think, because in particular, there's a whole discussion around Latine becoming a race on the US Census, and Black and Indigenous folks from Latin America that are residing in the US now are like, whoa, this is further erasure, right? And so I'm really interested in thinking about those questions, as well as thinking about Blackness as expansive, right? And I guess illuminating the histories that we have where Black people are not necessarily closed off into nation states, right? We've been communicating with each other for hundreds of years, right? Through migration, through different kinds of travel, through writing, through different influences on like social movements. And I think that's really important to understand where we're at today.
Around asking those questions of why, what are some of the methods that you use to answer those questions?
Yes. Okay. Good question. So, I'm formally trained as an anthropologist. My PhD is in anthropology, but I find my theoretical homes more in Black and Indigenous studies. With that said, I use a lot of ethnography. So I've spent months and months and months, and it will turn into years and years and years, talking with communities on the ground, and I put that in quotations, if you will, talking to everyday people about what Blackness means to them, what indigeneity means to them, what recognition or unrecognition means to them, especially in this moment where Mexico's like, okay, we're going to recognize our Black population, right? And continue to recognize our Indigenous population. But for them, they may see a difference between what Black means to them and what Black means to the state, and what Black means to non-Black folks. And same thing with indigeneity. And so I think ethnography really captures that friction between like the differences, but also gives an alternative view outside of, say, institutional racializations. But sometimes ethnography can be really tough. And when coupled with like really hard theory, and I put theory in quotations, like academic theory, some things cannot be translated. And so sometimes I turn to poetry, actually, poetry and the arts. I myself do not consider myself a visual artist per se, but I think sometimes looking at maps, right? Looking at visual art, looking at the way that poets can construct really complex ideas into a poem that says so much in so little. I use that as well to think about how sometimes there's not a grammar for the ways in which Blackness in Latin America, I mean, throughout the Americas, really, how Blackness cannot necessarily be, or especially around Blackness and indigeneity, how sometimes it cannot be articulated in the ways that the academy demands. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think that art too is such a, I think from a even historical standpoint, art for a lot of folks in these communities that you're talking about, Indigenous and Black communities who have not been included in some of these conversations, where historically art has been a way for them to express and convey some of those topics that, in broader society, or as you're talking about the state, has been relatively ignored and absent. And I also too, I don't know if this is too big of a question for the context of this podcast, but just to kind of go back a little bit, when you think about the motivations of the Mexican state versus how Black and Indigenous people are viewing themselves, like what are some of the motivations that you see from the Mexican state, and what are some of the gaps there?
That's a really good question. That is debatable.
Okay.
In my opinion, right, in my humble opinion, so a lot of people have documented what they call this like multiculturalist turn throughout the Americas, not just Latin America, right? In which post-civil rights, post-independence, there are these movements by marginalized communities to gain perhaps full rights or full citizenship, if you will, from the nation states to which they inhabit, right? Not necessarily belong, but inhabit, right? And so we see this in Latin America, I believe in the like 70s, 80s, with recognition of indigenous communities, particularly in Mexico, with the amendments to the Constitution in 1992. And it's supposed to essentially grant rights and recognition to communities that have historically been disenfranchised. And then we see this with Blackness in Black communities in Afro-Descendientes throughout Latin America in the 2000s. So we have a lot of shifts in places like Brazil, in Honduras, in Colombia, in Cuba. But in Mexico, that doesn't occur until 2015, when the intercensal survey first started to count Afro-Descendientes. And then you have the 2019 constitutional amendments, and then you have the 2020 census, right? Arguably, people are saying like, okay, yeah, this is the result of decades of fighting for recognition and rights for Black and Indigenous communities throughout the hemisphere, particularly essential for states to right their wrongs, right, to bring in whatever demands that communities may have. So whether it's land, infrastructure, anti-discrimination laws, etc. However, we have seen still that even with these recognitions, discrimination has not gone down, right? In fact, it has morphed into another beast that we have today, which I argue is, multiculturalism is just another mutation of mestizaje, which is genocidal for Black and Indigenous peoples. So now in Mexico, for instance, in the context where I work, we have people who are really, how would you say, discontented or discontent with what the state has been doing, because for them, they're like, okay, well, they don't recognize the Blackness that I recognize. Or the state may extract some of like the cultural portions of it to say, okay, yeah, we're this multicultural society, we celebrate this and that, or chata y tamarindo is African too, but it doesn't result in material improvements for the lives of Black and Indigenous peoples. And so, yeah, it's really interesting to see this shift, and to connect it to in the United States where we're at, where yes, we had the civil rights movement, we've had our own constitutional amendments, and Supreme Court rulings and stuff that are supposed to protect and uplift Black and Indigenous peoples here. But in fact, we seem to be worse off than we were in the 60s, right? Segregation is at an all-time high, right? The police are killing more and more Black people and Indigenous folks,
Yes.
Despite the so-called protections that the state has allotted us. And so I really am interested in tying this together hemispherically to say, okay, something has to give, right? Perhaps our liberation is not tied up with the state. And people have been saying that for years, for decades perhaps, but it hasn't been the dominant narrative, I think, in terms of liberation.
Yeah, I think also too, what you're getting at as well is, we see the things that people say change over time, but when it comes down to it, what is actually changing? Which, yeah, is something I've learned probably the hard way in the past couple of years, because it's like, oh, these people are saying Black Lives Matter and they did not want to say it, 4 years ago. But then it's like, oh, but they're still posting the same stuff on Facebook that they were before that was, harmful. And, so yeah, definitely. And I think also too that hemispheric and transnational connections are super important in this, because I think at least from a US standpoint, I think that there's a very isolationist kind of almost idea when we talk about history, or even and very narrow understanding of what it means to be Black. So I definitely really appreciate your work and the way that you are thinking about these questions. And so with that, thinking about transnational, you were one of our participants for the NEH Transnational Dialogues and Afro-Latinidad conference. So I just want to start off by talking about how did that expand to your previous scholarship?
Oh my gosh. Wow. Well, shout out to y'all first off. Y'all did an excellent conference. And I met people there that like I admire and cherish, both in my academic work and outside of academia. I learned quite a bit, right? So I work predominantly in Mexico, but I want to expand hemispherically. And being at the Institute this past summer really taught me that how important it is to expand hemispherically, right? I was in the room with folks that do work in the DR, in PR, in Brazil. There's another person that does work in Mexico, Karma Frierson, who's amazing, and I've known for some time. But to be able to talk to all of these folks and from different regions of Latin America and the Caribbean, but also different methodologies, taught me that there are endless ways to understand the issues that we've come together to discuss, particularly on Afro-Latinidad throughout the Americas. Yeah, especially like, meeting Zuli and Eva, that I think in a way gave me permission, now that I'm at the assistant professor level, to incorporate art into not only my teaching practice but my research, which is amazing, and I think my students really like that, and that has led to more expansive conversations about Blackness and indigeneity, and how to understand it differently than what it may be constructed as on the institutional level. So yeah, I'm feeling really, really grateful for the Institute, and all the time I was able to like sit and listen to everyone's different approaches to issues that affect Black folks hemispherically.
And then what were some of your favorite topics or moments from the conference?
Wow. Okay, the first that pops up into my head was the final, like the ending when everyone was dancing. Maybe edit that, I don't know.
No, that's okay. That's real.
Yeah,
that
like
stuff is important
amazing.
too.
Right? Because I remember, in contrast to that first day where we were all kind of like, all getting to know each other and everything was kind of quiet and all, but we got to know each other over the course of those 2 weeks. And so not only did we get to know each other, but we've sustained, like, we were trading information with each other. We're like, okay, let's keep in contact. We were thinking about collaborations in the future, right? So I think that moment kind of crystallized for me why spaces like these are great and why I enjoy them so much. I also, I think, just really loved connecting with my cohort mates throughout the Institute, right? So whether it was workshopping our ideas, right, which we did, I believe, the second week of the Institute, where we were thinking about, say, like syllabi or future book projects. I really appreciated the input from everyone. I really also appreciated just the scholars that came in that, like, I've been reading for years but never really had a chance to interact with. And some of my favorite scholars, like for instance Vanessa Valdez, came in and spoke, and that was really lovely, to connect with. And it just puts, like, a, how would you say, I guess the academy can be so scary sometimes, like, and very intimidating. Everyone is like in their books and writing all these really complex articles
Yes.
and stuff, but then you meet them and you're like, everyone's a person. And most are nice, some are not, but most are nice. And I saw that once again reflected in the Institute. I had just graduated when I took part, and I actually, in the middle of the Institute, I went back to Chicago to do the graduation ceremony and walk, if you will. So I think, lastly, I'm really grateful for having the Transnational Dialogues program, because it helped me kind of transition into this, like, okay, I'm no longer a grad student. This is my capacity in a faculty role, and I could see the possibilities of what I can do, right at this level. So, yeah, always grateful and always appreciative. I've even invited, so Zuli and Eva, came and did a performance at NYU Tisch a couple of weeks ago, and I took my class, right? I'm teaching a class on Black and Indigenous hemispheric feminisms.
Oh, that sounds cool.
Yeah, right. It's pretty rad. The students make it rad, and we had a week on grief, and it fell perfectly into the week that Zuli and Eva were here doing a performance called a Requiem for Black Grief, right? And it really, we came together afterwards and discussed it, and it really touched the students, right? So that's an immediate effect of the Institute from the summer.
Oh, that's awesome. And I'm jealous that you got to go.
It was
Yes.
great. Wow. Yeah, it was amazing.
Yeah. And, once again, I said this off camera, but congratulations on graduating and now being a professor at NYU. But now that you're, that person, you got the credentials. And so what were some of your key takeaways that you were able to take from the conference as you transition into this next phase of your career?
My mind keeps saying, stay open. Stay open. Stay open to different methodologies. Stay open to what people have to say, right? Especially if they're for liberation, right? I may not agree with some people's approaches to things, but if our end goal is liberation, that's our end goal.
Yeah.
And so I'm gonna sit with that and say that was my key takeaway from the conference. As I mentioned before, I got to meet many different people from different walks of life, from different parts of the Americas, coming in with different questions and thinking through them with different methodologies, right? And so, yeah, I think it reminded me to remain curious. And like I had no idea, for instance, that opera could be such an important way to think about Blackness and indigeneity, especially on Quisqueya, and Zuli taught me that, right? I was like, oh, opera is like a white German thing, right? But
yeah.
but the way in which people kind of usurp that and use it for their own community's gain, I think is really beautiful. Or like Eva's work in the census, right? I do work on the census, but I never thought of it in the ways that Eva thought about it, right? As an obituary. Thinking about Blackness in music with Karma's work, even thinking about Latinidad in psychology with Amy's work. Like there was so much richness, and yeah, it reminded me to just remain curious and stay open.
Yeah. And I think the stay open framework, that's how I know that you've got that liberation framework, because I feel like that's a very liberative way to think and about takeaways, and also it's almost a personal challenge as well to continue doing the work instead of staying in one place, where it's like, how can we take what we've learned and go further?
Truly.
And so for our listeners who have learned a lot from you during this time, and they're thinking to themselves, how can I know more? What are maybe 1 to 2 resources that they can check out for themselves?
Also a good question. So for those who speak English, the work of Alan Pelaez Lopez is wonderful. They're a Black Zapotec poet from Oaxaca, La Costa Chica in particular. Their poetry, they came up with the term Latina that is canceled, and I use that as an analytic framework to thinking about the limits of Latinidad and mestizaje when it comes to Black and Indigenous communities. And so they have work in both Spanish and in English. So for those in the US who cannot read Spanish or understand Spanish, I think that would be a really good jumping point, as well as the work of Dash Harris, who is a Black Panamanian woman living in the US, and she has been critiquing Latinidad with a colleague, Javier Wallace, also Afro-Panamanian from Austin, Texas. My high school was right next to the catfish spot.
That's super cool.
Yeah, like 20 years ago. So yeah. So those are really good sources in English. In Spanish, the Instagram Afro-Caracolas is really interesting. The work of Leona Uhuru, shout out to her. She has really, really beautiful things to say about Pan-Africanism and Prietitud in Mexico. She's an Afro-descendiente from Mexico City. Seinabu Diethu is a chef, an artist who thinks about Blackness, and she's Black Senegalese. Her dad is from Senegal and her mom is Nahuatl, or Nawa, excuse me, Nahuatl is the language, and also born and raised in Mexico City, and she has been talking about like Afro-descendientes in food, and in the intersection between Blackness, indigeneity, and foodways. And last but certainly not least, the work of filmmaker Ebony Bailey, who considers herself a Blaxican. She was born in California to a Black father and a mestiza Mexican woman. Her work, she's a filmmaker, and she thinks also about food and Blackness and migration throughout Mexico. So shout out to all those people who have constantly held me down in thinking about Mexico, Latinidad, Blackness, and then I guess there's two more. I'll give two more shout outs. Tito Midhans Alayon does incredible work on Blackness and transness. In Latin America, his work is mostly in Spanish. Itza Varela Huerta as well does stuff on Afro-descendientes in Mexico, particularly Black feminisms. And then Yoali Rodriguez, who is based here in the US, but from Puebla originally, does work on ecocide and grief work. That is really, really beautiful work in the Costa Chica where I too work. So those are some really good folks to start off with, whether you speak English or Spanish and want to learn more about Blackness and indigeneity in Mexico and throughout Latin America and the Caribbean.
Thank you for sharing those resources, and thank you for taking the time to join me today. I really enjoyed getting to learn more about your work.
Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this episode of Dialogues on Afro-Latinidad, please subscribe to our podcast and tell a friend. For links to the resources mentioned in the interview, visit our website at michellereedvasquez.com/podcast.